This paragraph is long, but it's worth the read because it captures the desperate circumstances of the Army. And you write that most of the soldiers have been in the Army from the very beginning of the struggle. They have experienced the humiliation of defeat at New York, deprivation at Valley Forge, victory at Yorktown, as well as exhausting marches and endless days of sheer boredom, punctuated by the terror of combat. There was no emotion they had not felt. The ebb and flow of the war had carried them to all parts of America. No longer did they simply know villages and farms of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or New York. They had been to the other colonies, now states, where citizens were finding it increasingly comfortable to call themselves Americans. They sensed that the revolution, at least the military aspect of it, was nearly over, and hence their usefulness. When they should have been celebrating and wearing garlands of victory, their overriding sentiment was not jubilation, but a gnawing sense of abandonment by Congress and country. So, at the time of pending peace, why did it create a sense of abandonment for the soldiers?
The revolution was a transforming event for the men who served in the Continental Army. Imagine what it must have been like for a country boy from Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, the Carolinas, who probably had never been more than 5 miles from home. He now joins an army which is going to take him to places, distant places, that we might think, and he might think as exotic. He saw other people, he met other people, he found that they had common interests, to begin to use the word American rather than Virginian or New Yorker, to think of themselves in a greater context, to think of themselves as part of a great cause. And I'm sure that they took great pride in that. It was a glorious, glorious moment. They grew as individuals to see this great breadth of a nation and great promise. And they did, as I indicated, they suffered tremendously, gave up a great deal. They gave up years away from their family. They gave up the peace and comfort of a home, and in some instances gave up their lives or gave up their health and well-being. So they had sacrificed so much, and then to find that the nation for which they had sacrificed so much, the nation as represented by the Congress, seems to have abandoned them. Where was their reward for this? Why weren't they being paid? Why weren't they being recognized? They did feel abandoned. They felt deeply abandoned by this. And at the end of the war, many of these men returned home feeling this sense of loss. And by the way, they didn't return home to parades. There were no great parades for these men. They came back to their farms in Brookfield, Massachusetts, or Staunton, Virginia, or wherever it was. There was no one standing in the streets to greet them. They came back to re-engage in their lives as best they could. There was no grand veteran ceremonies. It's only years later, when the Republic has succeeded, when we are a real nation, that people look back on the Revolution as that grand moment with great nostalgia. And so then, when the veterans are in their tottering years of 70 or 80 years old, they're brought out to remember the grand, glorious days of the Revolution. But those weren't the moments of 1783, 84, 85. Those were sad and lonely moments. The glory comes afterwards, not in the immediate aftermath of the war. So they did feel abandoned. They did feel that they had been left by the roadside by the Congress and by their fellow Americans.
That's so sad.
It's very sad. And we should remember that these men that we so celebrate, and rightfully so celebrate today, were in their own lifetime not so grandly recognized.
Would you describe the soldiers desperate at the point where they were petitioning Congress and not receiving their payment?
They were desperate, yes, but men are often desperate in situations. The question is, what do you do in that desperation? How do you act it out? At whom do you strike, for example? And so while these men were desperate, they did not have leadership, and for that I think we ought to be grateful. Things could have been quite different if these desperate men had fallen under the leadership. If, for example, Henry Knox or Washington for that matter, had decided that I'm going to lead these desperate men to achieve what is rightfully theirs, but they did not. They had faith in the Republic, which they had helped to establish. That was the principle upon which they had fought, and they would not give it up. So they didn't give in to emotion. They didn't give in to desperation. So it was a moment when they truly, the leaders of the revolution, truly distinguished themselves.